Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I rise tonight at a time when we face a quiet crisis in this country. President Obama and many on the other side of the aisle tell us that the economy has improved, we've turned the corner, we're out of the woods, but I got to tell you, too many Americans are being left behind. In fact, historic numbers of Americans are disconnected from work. It's a quiet crisis. It's affecting them and their families. It's affecting our economy, I think, in very fundamental ways. It's one reason we haven't seen the kind of economic growth we hope for, because not enough Americans are involved in productive work because so many are out of work. The unemployment numbers, by the way, don't show the degree of the problem. Unemployment number around 7% doesn't show the fact that a lot of folks have left the workforce altogether. This crisis includes also 3.7 million long-term unemployed. These are people who have been out of work for 6 months or more. This is also at historic levels. During this recent recession and during this weak recovery over the last 5 years, we've had numbers of long-term unemployed over 6 months at historic levels. In fact, the number of long-term unemployed right now is higher than it's been during any recession in our nation's history, except for the most recent one 5 years ago. Second, we have a lot of people who have left looking for work altogether. So a lot of these folks were long-term unemployed. They've now given up looking for work. 10.5 million Americans aren't even counted in the unemployment numbers because they've given up looking for work. The economists call this the labor participation rate. It is at historic lows for men going back to the 1940s. In other words, more men are out of work. That means not working or not even looking for a job than we've ever had as a percentage of our population since we started keeping track of these statistics in the 1940s. For men and women combined, you can go back to the 1970s. The numbers are so low, the participation rate in work. That goes back to the Carter era when we had double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates. You've got to go back to that economy that was cratering in order to see these numbers of people who are out of work, not looking for work, not even trying. So we have a real problem in this country, and we're not addressing it. To make matters worse, people are saying, well, Rob, this is actually the baby boomers and it's people retiring early, so it's not that bad. That's not true. To make matters worse, it's a lot of young people. There's a recent Brookings study that came out a couple weeks ago that indicates that actually a lot of the problem is young men, single men, who are choosing not to work or cannot find a job. And therefore, they drop out of the workforce altogether. Again, this is not reflected in the unemployment numbers. This is not even reflected in the long-term unemployment numbers. Disappointment after disappointment for many of these workers leads to them giving up looking for work altogether. These Americans feel like what we're doing here in Washington doesn't really affect them and their lives. They feel like we're not dealing with this issue. So the underemployed, the unemployed, the long-term unemployed, the folks who are so disconnected from work they're not even looking for a job, they're looking at us in Washington and saying, what are you going to do to help? They are the reason that I supported tonight this extension of unemployment insurance. Now, this was not exactly the legislation that I wanted, but also it's not exactly the legislation that was brought to the floor. The other side of the aisle, the Democrats brought legislation to the floor that was long-term extension, emergency basis. This is for people who have been out of work for over 26 weeks. This is the federal addition to the state unemployment insurance that generally is in place for people up to 26 weeks. The Democrat version was long-term, over a year. It also was not paid for, which takes us further into debt and deficit, which hurts the economy. It also did not have any reforms. The legislation that passed tonight with my vote and some other Republicans had three things. One, short-term, 5 months instead of a year. Two, it's paid for, so it doesn't take us further into debt and deficit. And three, it does have some reforms to try to make the unemployment system work better to help these people who are long-term unemployed who otherwise have very little prospect of getting gainful employment and being productive members of our economy. In fact, there's some studies out there saying that only 10 or 15% of them would normally be likely to get a job once you're out of work for 6 months or more because of the resume gap, because of the skills gap. So we got into this legislation that I'll talk about later in more detail, some reforms that add some skills training for the long-term uninsured. The notion here is that there are jobs available out there, and there are a lot of people, as we talked about, out of work or long-term unemployed in this case, but they don't have the skills to match the jobs that are out there. So the notion is to bring the skills and the jobs together to deal with the skills gap. Now, most on my side of the aisle, all but I think 6 of us, were against this unemployment extension because they argued that instead we need pro-growth policies to get this economy moving. I totally agree with them about the pro-growth policies. The ultimate solution here is not another extension of unemployment insurance. It is to reform the program rather than just another check to add this skills training, which we'll talk about in a second. And we need to do more there. But we also have got to do what Jack Kennedy used to talk about. President Kennedy said famously, a rising tide lifts all boats. We need the rising tide. We need to create more economic growth and opportunity. And there is a plan to do that. It's called the Jobs for America plan. The Senate Republicans have all signed off on it. It has 7 elements, all of which make a lot of sense. One is to ensure that on health care we actually reduce the costs, increase choice, which is hurting the economy now because the costs are going up, not down, and sometimes dramatically. All of the above energy strategy to use the energy here in the ground, and to have an all-of-the-above strategy to get America's economy going, moving our economy forward. We can do a lot more there. Living within our means, the reason this unemployment insurance extension was paid for is that we Republicans insisted on it. Why? Because the debt and deficit is like a wet blanket over the economy. We do have to keep ourselves from going further into debt with the $17 trillion debt. The tax code reform is necessary to spur economic growth. Both on the individual side and the business side, our tax code is antiquated and inefficient. It will help to give the economy a shot in the arm if we can reform the tax code. Regulations, unshackling job creators, helping to ensure that regulations are sensible, that they are not making it more difficult for small businesses to create jobs and opportunity. This is something we should be doing on a bipartisan basis. Increasing exports, that means jobs. Now, this president and this administration has not been able to move forward with any export agreements because the president has not been able to get trade promotion authority. In fact, some on the other side of the aisle said he won't get it. That would be tragic for America's workers, for America's farmers, for the people that provide services. We want to push more exports because they create good-paying jobs and good benefits. And then finally, and significantly, part of this Republican plan for jobs is to create a competitive workforce to close the skills gap. That's what we're talking about here with the unemployment insurance issue. We need to ensure that our workforce is meeting the needs of the 21st century, meaning a lot of technology jobs, even in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, bioscience jobs, information technology jobs. Those jobs are out there, as I said earlier. But unfortunately, the federal government has not done a good job in providing the skills, giving people the tools to access those jobs. So we've made some steps in this legislation. The legislation we passed tonight ensures that job training reforms are part of long-term unemployment insurance. The reforms require officials to connect with the unemployed early in the process and provide important information they're now not getting about the skills and credentials that businesses in their area, in their region, are looking for. We've also included provisions to strengthen the skills assessment process to ensure that the long-term unemployed have a better idea of the specific skills necessary to become more competitive in the job market. That assessment is really important. A lot of these folks are starting to give up hope. The assessment's important for them to understand where they are and where they can be. These measures are intended to give the unemployed the opportunity to attain critical skills and credentials that are regionally relevant and that are nationally portable so they can access not only available jobs in their area, but so that they can find other jobs around the country. There are some states, as you know, where you have unemployment as low as 3%. Other states where unemployment is as high as 9%. So people do need to know what the opportunities are should they be able and willing to move. So that's part of this unemployment extension that we did tonight. And that's something that was put in place because of a negotiation between Republicans and Democrats alike to ensure that, yes, it was paid for, yes, it was not long-term, but short-term, and third, that we did put some skills training in place. And I want to thank Senator Jack Reed, Senator Dean Heller, and others who worked with us to ensure that was part of this package. But folks, that's just the beginning. We've got to do a lot more in terms of ensuring that our workforce programs in the federal government are meeting the needs of the 21st century. So part of the Republican jobs plan is to say, let's take the next step. And by the way, there's a commitment from both sides of the aisle, from the people who work this out, to work during this short-term extension to try to increase the opportunities to provide people the tools that they need. We have big problems, as I said. We have a lot of people who are long-term unemployed, historic levels. We have historic levels of people who are disconnected from work altogether, and yet we have jobs that are out there and available. They say there are 3.9 million jobs around the country currently available and unfilled. 3.9 million jobs. That means about 25% of those who are out of the workforce could have an opportunity for a job if they had the skills and had the ability to meet the requirements for those jobs. In Ohio, we've got over 100,000 jobs available. You can go on the website and see them. And these are not just part-time or minimum wage positions. According to a recent study, Ohio is third behind only California and Texas in skilled factory job openings, full-time jobs with benefits that often turn into long-term careers. The problem of chronic unemployment is holding back our economy. By not having the people to fill those jobs, the economy is not reaching its potential. In fact, some of those jobs are going overseas to find those skilled workers. The Manufacturing Institute recently concluded that 74% of manufacturers are experiencing workforce shortages or skills deficiency that keeps them from expanding their operations. 74% of manufacturers aren't expanding plant and equipment and creating more jobs as they could because they don't have the workforce. So I viewed this unemployment insurance debate as an opportunity to talk about this issue, an opportunity to put in place some initial reforms, some first steps for more skills assessment, more training, to encourage people to get the credentials they need to get a job. But it's only the first step. We should do much, much more. The federal government's already very involved, by the way, in worker retraining. Not in a very productive way, but very involved. There are 47 different federal workforce training programs spread over 7, 8, or 9 departments and agencies, often overlapping. Often the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. It costs us, by the way, as taxpayers, about $15 billion a year. So about $15 billion a year is going into worker retraining, yet look at the results. Again, record numbers long-term unemployed. Record numbers of men disconnected from work. Something's not working. One of the things that the Government Accountability Office found is that very little is known about the effectiveness of these 47 programs. They have said, unbelievably, that only 5 of these federal programs have conducted an impact study of their efforts since 2004. 47 programs, only 5 have conducted the kind of performance measures you would expect for the government to do to be sure taxpayers' monies are being spent right, and you certainly would be doing in the private sector. The GAO, I think, is kind of generous in its assessment because those millions of unfilled jobs and millions more struggling workers are as incriminating an indictment of our retraining programs as any impact study could ever be. This is a story I hear all the time. Back home in Ohio, when I talk to workers, when I talk to businesses, when I talk to educators, people are frustrated. People are seeing these federal dollars being spent, but not for actual training. What's unbelievable to me is recent data shows us that the number of credentials people are getting through these federal workforce training programs is actually going down, not up, at a time when it's clear that credentials are a key way to get a job. It's unfair to employers who have open positions because they can't find qualified candidates to fill them. It's unfair to taxpayers who send money to Washington believing the government's going to be a good steward of those funds, and it's not. And of course, it's unfair to the millions of Americans who want to build a better life for themselves and for their families, but they need the tools. You know, a lot of jobs were lost in this last recession. Unfortunately, I believe a lot of them aren't coming back. But other jobs are being created. But again, they're jobs that require a higher level of skill. We've got to be sure that we are doing a better job providing people with those tools to get the skills that they need. It's part of the plan that Senate Republicans are talking about. A small step was taken tonight with the unemployment insurance extension. I don't think we necessarily explained it very well to all of our colleagues, but it was part of what happened tonight on the floor of the United States Senate. And I'm hopeful that over the next few months, we'll take the next important step, which is actually to change the way these federal programs work so they are more effective at dealing with this quiet crisis we have in our country. I have a specific proposal that I like. It's called the Career Act. The Career Act, you can look at it online. Go to portman.senate.gov. My co-sponsor is Michael Bennett, who spoke here earlier tonight. He's a Democrat from Colorado. He's a former education superintendent. He understands that we need to change these programs to make them more efficient, to incentivize success. We have performance measures in our proposal, for instance. We do need to streamline and consolidate these programs. We also need to be sure that we are rewarding job training providers that produce measurable results in actual job placement. Seems like a pretty simple concept, but it's not happening now, as the GAO has told us. The unemployment extension, in my view, buys us a couple more months. But that's time that we ought to be going to work, to do the harder work, to ensure that workers have the skills they need to compete in this global economy. And again, companies look globally for workers these days, particularly larger companies. If we're not providing the skilled workforce here, our economy is not as productive as it could be, not meeting its potential. The rising tide is not lifting all boats because it's not rising. But we're also going to lose jobs overseas where there is more focus on the STEM disciplines, on engineering and math, on skills training. We've got to do a much better job at the federal government level, working with the states, working with the private sector. One thing we do in the Career Act is we connect the federal funds with the actual private sector jobs that are out there to ensure that we're getting a better result, not training people up for jobs that aren't even available. So let's spend these next few months working on more strategies to help folks get jobs. Let's work on all of this because we need to have a growing economy. But with regard to the training part, let's fix a system that isn't serving the unemployed. It isn't serving the taxpayer. Let's deal with this quiet crisis. Let's restore hope and opportunity to America's workers. Mr. President, with that, I yield back my time.